These are cards you should never draft in MTG Foundations. They are actively bad, and putting them in your decks will hurt your chances of winning. First up is Fishing Pole. For 1 mana, you get an equipment that you can spend 2 mana to equip, and then another mana plus tapping the equipped creature to use, with the hopes that when you untap that creature, you'll get a 1/1 fish. It's just so much mana for so little payoff, and sure, you can use it multiple times, but there's just better things to be doing in draft, and you're going to be much happier if you leave this card on the sidelines. Next is Crackling Cyclops. 3 mana for a 0/4, even if it has the ability to grow temporarily sometimes, is just not great. You need to be able to block and attack in the early turns of your games of Limited, and the fact that your opponent can often attack into this with impunity because you don't have mana up is such a liability, especially in a format with Raid, where there are cards that actively reward you for attacking and being able to get into combat in the first place. Crackling Cyclops has the ability to do some things, but the fact that you need to enable it with non-creature spells makes it really tricky to use, really finicky, especially when you're curving out and tapping out of your mana in the early turns of the game, and it really just doesn't justify that risk to be worth including in your decks. Next is Midnight Snack. This card just does so little when you're behind that you can't really justify including it in your decks, especially because it doesn't even do that much when you're ahead, because you'd rather just have a card that adds more pressure to the board. So if you're behind, you have a card that can't block, can't interact, and you're not triggering raid, so it's just doing stone cold nothing because you're not attacking when you're behind. And if you're ahead, you'd rather just have a card that you can just add the pressure with. You play another 3 mana creature, you add another flyer to the board, you add an equipment or something of that nature. And Midnight Snack just doesn't really do either of those things. Sure, if you get into a mid-game board stall and you can attack and you maybe can get a bunch of foods and then sacrifice them all and use Midnight Snack, that's a lot of ifs. And overall, Midnight Snack is just a card that just doesn't really do enough to justify including it. Next is Juggernaut, a classic Magic the Gathering card that is just past its prime. For 4 mana, you get a 5/3 that has to attack, which is just really, really rough because there are so many situations where you don't want to attack. The board is stalled. Your opponent has a 3/1 creature where they get a huge mana advantage when you attack with your Juggernaut. Your opponent, you need your Juggernaut to hold back on defense so you can actually block your opponent's creatures. All of these situations are things where having to attack is a huge liability. So don't be fooled by the fact that it's colorless. Don't be fooled by the fact that it's a card you've heard of before. Don't be fooled by the fact that it's an uncommon. Juggernaut is just not a great card, and putting in your deck will hurt your chances of winning. Next up is Spitfire Lagak, a card that has a lot of similar cases to the Juggernaut, though it doesn't have to attack every turn. It's a 4 mana 3/4 with a very marginal ability, and it will often play out as a 4 mana 3/4 that doesn't really have a tremendous impact on the game with its pings. There are better things to be doing for 4 mana, so even though this can interact in combat, it can attack, it can block, so it's better than some of the cards on this list, it's still really bad and a card that will hurt you by putting it in your deck because it's not able to do enough to justify it in a world where there are so many better things to be doing for your mana. Also, if you do love Spitfire Lagak, you'll get one last pick and you can put it into your deck out of pity if you really want to do that. So you still don't have to invest an actual draft pick in the card. Next is Inspiring Call, a card that just will not do enough to justify its inclusion. There are not enough games where you're in a close battle where you have multiple creatures with +1/+1 counters on them and can use Inspiring Call in an effective manner. Because if you have 2 creatures with Inspiring Call and you get into combat and you win that combat because of Inspiring Call, you're getting like a 3-for-1 or something like that. But then in a bunch of other scenarios, you're getting stone cold nothing. You're on the defensive, so you don't really have the mana to hold up Inspiring Call. You have no creatures with +1/+1 counters on them, which is a very common scenario in Limited. You have no creatures at all. You have like one creature with a +1/+1 counter on it, and then you would rather just play another creature instead of using your Inspiring Call. There's just so many different scenarios where this card is just too much mana and too ineffectual to be worth including, and you're not going to be wanting to play this card as a result. Next is Gleaming Barrier, another card in the case of it has toughness, it can block, it can come down for 2 mana and technically do things, but it's so weak and ineffectual that putting it in your deck is still going to hurt you overall. The fact that your opponent can still attack into it with impunity, which as we already discussed is a liability in a world where raid is a mechanic, or even a world where there's potential lifelinkers that are like 2-powered lifelinkers where your opponent gets to still trigger their life gain cards, things like that. Gleaming Barrier doesn't help with that. In the games where you've both played a bunch of cards, you've traded off resources, and you're in a top deck battle, you top deck a Gleaming Barrier, it can't attack, so you can't really chip in for damage, which is actually a big thing as well. And overall, there's just better things to be doing in the modern era of Magic the Gathering. Next is Exsanguinate, a card that is good in Commander but terrible in Limited. The fact is you need to be able to interact in combat. You need creatures, you need removal spells, you need combat tricks, and you just don't have room for a card like Exsanguinate, which is only good when your opponent's at a very low life total and you have the mana to cast Exsanguinate for lethal damage. In other scenarios, Exsanguinate is just not doing enough. And so you would rather just play a card that's good in a ton of scenarios versus the one very specific scenario where you're often already winning anyway. Because when you get your opponent really low, it often means that you've been able to pressure them and you have attackers and you have all of these other things. And Exsanguinate is only specifically good in the games where you've had all of those things and then your opponent has stabilized and then you draw your Exsanguinate. And that's just a lot of ifs and lots of scenarios that you just need to have one very specific scenario for Exsanguinate, whereas there are tons of other cards you could be playing that have power and toughness that are still going to be good when you are in those spots where you just need to put in the last few points of damage. So just avoid putting Exsanguinate in your deck. Don't be fooled by the fact that it is good in other formats. This is limited. Limited does not need Exsanguinate in your decks. Next is Adventuring Gear, equipment that has a very aggressive lean to it, but just ends up not being worth it because of the limitations of the landfall mechanic. Because you can't really use Adventuring Gear on the defensive. Sure, there's Evolving Wilds, but that's going to be very marginal to trigger Adventuring Gear. So you have to put this in aggressive decks, but then eventually you run out of land drops and your Adventuring Gear doesn't do a ton. It also makes you very vulnerable to removal spells because Adventuring Gear not only is an equipment that needs to be put into only aggressive decks and only hyper aggressive decks because it's really bad on blocks, but also needs to be used in the early turns when you're still making all of your land drops, which means your opponent can really leverage removal spells effectively to kill the creature the Adventuring Gear gets put on. You're down some mana, your pressure is evaporating, and Adventuring Gear is the cause, because instead of playing a creature that could actually have some effects on defense or be helping with pressure on its own, you had put a card that was a modifier card that was an unreliable modifier at best. So avoid putting Adventuring Gear in your decks. It's just not going to justify its inclusion enough. And especially if you top deck it in the mid game where it's just an absolutely atrocious card. So yeah, avoid Adventuring Gear. Next, and finally, is Bolt Wave, a card that looks like a constructed card because, once again, it's good and constructed in some decks, but not a limited card. You need to be able to impact the board state, attack, block, creatures. Think of those things, the value that you're getting over time from your cards, the fact that if you top deck this in a board stall, if you top deck this when you both have an empty board state, it doesn't really do a ton to give you a sustained advantage. You want to have creatures with power and toughness, removal spells, combat tricks, and then some card draw or things of card advantage nature, things like that, and Bolt Wave just doesn't do it, where if your opponent's at 3 life, sure, you win the game. But you know what else would win you the game? A 3/3 creature that could attack your opponent for 3 and also help you on defense and in all these other scenarios. So don't put Bolt Wave in your decks and you'll be doing a lot better right off the bat. That's going to do it for this video. If you made it to the end, leave hashtag 10traps. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.